He was born in 1948 here in Charleston. He lived at the corner of Wentworth and Anderson Streets as a boy. He attended school here until 10th grade, and then went on to finish his high school education in Brooklyn, New York, and then to graduate from Shaw University in Raleigh, North Carolina, and did his master's at Central Michigan University. For 25 years, he was an editor and writer and columnist for the Post and Courier, alongside producing and hosting black music programs on the NPR affiliate radio station here in Charleston. He came of age during the dawn of the National Black Arts Movement and was engaged in various efforts to connect the Low Country to that initiative. He was founding president of Charleston's Moja Arts Festival, started in 1984. In 1980, he co-founded the Piccolo Spoleto Festival Jazz After Hours series, and many of you will remember how amazingly successful and packed McCrady's was last year during Spoleto for his jazz series. He also co-founded the Charleston Jazz Initiative, a multi-year research project started in 2003, and he was a producer of the now very successful Charleston Jazz Orchestra and a founding board member of Jazz Artists of Charleston, representing organisation. He wrote Charleston Jazz, the library's copy of that is up there, and he was a contributing editor of Whiskey and Jazz by Hans Hoffringer. He freelanced until the end, and many of us looked forward to with bated breath to his jazz column in the Post and Courier's weekly Scene magazine. He could also be found most evenings towards the end of the week, sitting usually right at the front, sometimes at the bar, at Charleston Grill, listening very attentively to the Quentin Baxter Ensemble and others. And the circle of friends that he gathered there was a fascinating cross-section of the Charleston community. It's actually there that I met John Simpkins, for example, who spoke here last week. So here at the Library Society, we were very blessed to have the chance to host Jack for a very special wide-angle lunch, in which he conclusively convinced us that Charleston's role in the history of America's own classical art form, jazz, was at least as important as that of the more commonly referenced New Orleans. Last night, before we heard this news, we listened to an album that he very specially recommended, and he touched us very much, and we will miss it. So on to a happy thing, which is that we're very delighted to have Sharifa Rhodes-Pitts with us here today. Originally from Houston in Texas, she graduated in the year 2000 from Harvard University, where she read Afro-American studies and visual and environmental studies, filmmaking being the main focus on that side. She was awarded a Fulbright Scholarship in Creative Writing to attend St Andrews University in the United Kingdom in 2006. And the small, brief potted biography you will have on your chairs mentions various awards that she has been given. Others that I didn't mention were, in 2009, a New York Foundation for the Arts Fellow in Non-Fiction Literature, and a laureateship at the Centre International de Collet in Paris, also in 2009. And lately, an artist in residence at a studio in the woods in New Orleans in the spring of last year, after which Sharifa chose to stay on in New Orleans. She's a writer through and through, but I thought you might be interested to know that she also has a very special interest in agriculture and the environment, and is very widely travelled in Europe, India, Turkey, among other places we've had the chance to discuss. Most fittingly of all, given her presence today at the Library Society, she's very interested in publishing and in the handcrafts of bookmaking. And in fact, while she was at the studio in the woods, she was focused on a book arts project. And so we hope you'll feel very at home here, because we've just opened a book bindery and an archival lab, where we will offer classes as well as a space for the restoration of the Library Society's collection. Sharifa Rhodes-Pitts is currently working on a trilogy about African Americans and utopia. The first volume is the subject of today's talk, Harlem is Nowhere, which was published by Little Brown in January of this year in the US and by Granta Books in the UK in July. Whether you are familiar with the history or the present of Harlem, I really recommend that you read this book. It's a very special and unique work, almost a scrapbook of fascinating insights into Harlem, but unlike a scrapbook, Sharifa has delved well below the surface. It is deeply considered, it's erudite, it's rigorous, it's multifaceted. You can dive into her thought processes and revel in the intellectual and spiritual leaps she makes. And it's all done in a very poetic and utterly literary way that will captivate you from beginning to end. The third volume of the trilogy will be about the South, and I hope that after this first visit to Charleston, that Sharifa will consider Charleston one of the many places she can call home. Thank you for coming, Sharifa.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so glad to be here. It was a wonderful surprise in the middle of the summer when I heard from Caroline asking if I'd be interested in coming to Charleston. I said yes immediately. It's my first book, and it's still a completely amazing and surreal experience to have it find readers, especially when they sort of seek you out. From Caroline to an email that arrived in my inbox the other day from a literature professor in Iraq. So it goes right along with the nature of this book and its subject matter. I always say to people that Harlem is a word that you could say anywhere in the world, that I'm convinced you would get some reaction, that people have some association with that place, with that word, whether it's from hearing jazz music or knowing the literature of the place, even just maybe a poem or two from Langston Hughes, or knowing the political figures that came out of that place, from the very formidable Congressman Adam Clayton Powell to Malcolm X. And then in popular culture, of course, the Harlem Globetrotters, with their zany, entertaining sports, or, as I said, so much music and art. And so the fact that this book has taken me places all over the country really is a testament more to the place and the stories that are lodged there, and that in so many stories that never even made it into my ears or into my book. So I'm happy to be sharing with you a small part of that. I'm just grateful to Caroline and the Library Society for hosting me. I want to start with a picture that when I first discovered it really blew my mind. So I went on a tour of Harlem in order to learn what tourists were told when they were walking through my own neighborhood, because when I first arrived, there were lots of tour buses going around. It felt strange in a way to be in a place that was observed in that way. And I'm sure living in Charleston, which is another place that has so much history and attention on preservation, there's also that maybe strange tension between living in the midst of a place that's preserved for what's happened and then living your daily contemporary life there. When the tour began, the guide passed around this photo and asked us, what we think it was. And it turned out that we were standing very near this spot. It's 133rd Street between 5th and 6th Avenues, and contemporaneously 6th Avenue is known as Lenox Avenue and Malcolm X Boulevard in Harlem. It's also right where I lived. So to look at this place, this is 1879, 1880 or so. It's right at the moment when developers were beginning to build in Harlem. And there's something about this landscape that was just really mystifying to me, because it looked both like a place that was being built and like a place that was destroyed. Because in contemporary Harlem, you might have seen something rather similar to this landscape, where there were empty lots in between buildings for very different reasons, of course. Now, Harlem this was at the beginning of Harlem's settlement. That area was a farming suburb of New York. This was the wilderness, really. And it's just in the history of the settlement of New York, there was just that northward movement. And Harlem was a place where speculators were building houses, anticipating a great arrival of middle-class people. So they built this sort of middle-class suburb, these townhouses. And what they didn't bargain for is that mass transit in New York did not arrive as quickly as their own speculations. So even as these really nice houses were being built. And eventually that street that you see, if it gappened, would have been filled in. And in the very back of the picture, which is it's far too unclear, this blow up, but you can still see a little bit of wilderness in the background, the trees and things like that. The city hadn't quite reached the far reaches of Manhattan. But even as soon as it was built, they were empty houses. It was a bubble, not unlike what we experienced lately. And in the course of trying to figure out what to do with that bubble, there were some really enterprising Black businessmen who were inspired to buy property and rent it to Blacks. Previously in the history of New York, Black settlement moved again to build the enlargement of the city. So in the Dutch time, the area known as Wall Street, beyond all that was utter wilderness and a place where there were, of course, the Native Americans who were defending their land were engaged in antagonism with the colonists. And so actually the enslaved Blacks and some of the free Blacks were settled on that barrier as a buffer between the colony and the natives. And there was sort of a movement up to different places. By the time Harlem was built, most of Black New York was situated in what's now Midtown, sort of in the 30s, 40s, 50s, on the west side. And once these businessmen took it upon themselves to extend housing to Blacks in Harlem, there was a great movement from Lower Manhattan to these really lovely houses. Whole churches moved at once, and then their parishioners moved as well. And so the settlement of Harlem begins in that way. What interested me as I was beginning this book was especially the movement, a different movement that happened, not just within Manhattan, but the movement of Blacks from the South to New York and to Harlem. And part of my interest in that was my own experience moving from Texas to New York. And then once I arrived, finding myself really finding an affinity with elders that I met in the street who told me their stories of their arrivals. And so part of what I'm going to read to you just now is from a chapter that's called Into the City of Refuge. And it tells some stories from my own first arrival in Harlem, but also stories that I read. Because of course my very first arrival in Harlem was through books and literature. And so much of the writing that came out of the Harlem Renaissance, there are these stories of arrival. And so kind of using the characters from several different novels, I track this moment when Black Harlem was gathering its forces. A little sip of water for this. Emma Lou Morgan arrives in Harlem with the turn of a page. She has come far. How was the journey, Emma Lou? She keeps the details close to her chest, hidden away in the space between the end of one chapter and the beginning of the next. We are not told what she saw crossing the country from Los Angeles, or how long it took, whether sleep on the journey was fitful, or if there were moments on the way when she felt like getting off that train and making her way back home to Boise, Idaho, which she had fled, looking for education and enlightenment in the California sun. That didn't last long. Soon she was filled with, quote, more determination than ever to escape should the chance present itself. Emma Lou took her chance when it came, with little thought given to the vehicle of her flight. Quote, once more, Emma Lou fled into an unknown town to escape the haunting chimera of intraracial color prejudice. Emma Lou Morgan is running from her Black skin. Wallace Thurman tells us as much in the epigraph to his novel, The Blacker the Berry. The quote goes, my color shrouds me in, from the poet County Cullen. Where better to send his heroine than Harlem, and how better for her to arrive there than not to arrive at all. The emphasis is placed on what she left behind. Leaving is the main thing. Soon she would have gone any place to escape, and so she is soon in Harlem. She could hardly believe it herself. It did seem strange, she says, this being in Harlem only a few weeks before she had been over 3,000 miles away. Emmylou is philosophical. She's thinking about time, and she is thinking about distance and the immutability of the two. Soon enough, she glimpses her own folly. She says, "What was that line in Cullen's verse? I run, but time's abreast with me." She had only traversed space and defied distance. Helga Crane has just as far to come. Like Emmylou, her journey was not direct. Last, it was Chicago, and before that, Naxos, a little southern town with its stultifying black college propriety. She leads, and she leads, and she leads. But when she arrives in Harlem, quote, again, she had that strange, transforming experience, and the watchword here is again. This time, not so pleadingly, the magic sense of having come home. What does Helga Crane know of home? Both black and Danish, like Nella Larsen, who made her. Helga has been yanked through the pages of quicksand, from one home to another, and then yet another. But homeless Helga sings that, quote, Harlem, teeming black Harlem, had welcomed her and lulled her into something that was, she was certain, peace and contentment. Oh, to be in Harlem again after 2 years away. This is Jake laying first sight on Harlem, arriving home from Europe after the Great War. His ecstasy can hardly be contained. It can hardly be believed. The deep dyed color and the thickness and the closeness and the noises and the sugared laughter and the honey talk and ragtime and blues. Never mind that Jake sounds more like a tourist than a joyous returnee. He does not return to the bosom of a woe-begotten mother, but to good old Harlem, chocolate Harlem, sweet Harlem. This is the Harlem to which downtown revelers and downtown readers of Claude McKay's Home to Harlem flocked. Oh, the contagious fever of Harlem, burning everywhere in the dark-eyed Harlem, burning now in Jake's sweet blood. He stood up and his feet burned. Then he remembered. He remembered walking until his feet were blistered where the soles had worn bare on his shoes. He remembered walking, but he didn't know why he kept on walking. Wretched Jewel wakes up after his first night in Harlem, a rainy night spent on a bench in St. Nicholas Park. He is numb and hungry, his meager belongings in a small bundle, the luggage of swift departure. He is dazed by the streetlights reflected in the wet pavement. The tall buildings of City College, up the hill from the park, remind him, or his creator, George Wiley Henderson, in Jewel, like the walls of Babylon. Where is good old Harlem, chocolate Harlem, sweet Harlem? Nowhere. A sign on a lamppost said West 135th Street, but it didn't mean anything to him. King Solomon Gillies arrives in the same spot as Jewel, under the same circumstances. They have both murdered men. But when he emerges from the train at 135th Street in Lenox, he meets, quote, clean air, blue sky, bright sunlight. Then slowly, spreadingly, he grinned at what he saw. Maybe he saw Emmylou and Helga and Jewel, new arrivals like himself, still staggered by the pace of life in Harlem. But perhaps he also saw and was impressed by the already acclimated, debonair, and citified habitués of the black metropolis. What is certain he saw, quote, Negroes at every turn, up and down Lenox Avenue, up and down 135th Street, big, lanky Negroes, short, squat Negroes, black ones, brown ones, yellow ones, men standing idle on the curb, women, bundle-laden, trudging reluctantly homeward, children rattle-trapping along the sidewalks, here and there, a white face drifting along, but Negroes predominantly, overwhelmingly. There was assuredly no doubt of his whereabouts. This was Negro Harlem. Many of these books were among those on a reading list I made for myself around age 14. On the first page of a composition book, I wrote the heading, Books Written During the Harlem Renaissance, and plotted an itinerary through my library shelves, searching for this El Dorado of black literature. Besides these, there was Jean Toomer's Cane and novels by Jessie Fawcett. I read Federico Garcia Lorca's Harlem poems from El Poeta en Nueva York, in which he sets an unforgettable scene. I Harlem, I Harlem, I Harlem. I didn't need the facing page of my bilingual edition to translate what he saw. Negros, 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 negros. Thus goes the attempt of El Poeta to come to terms with Harlem. Palabras fail. Those are the barest facts of the situation. He escapes the realm of the poetic and tumbles toward the sociological. To understand the problems presented by this bustling horde, one need only juxtapose Garcia Lorca's frenetic naming of things. Blacks, 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 blacks. With Ludi's idea, that's another character that I skipped over, on the pages of Anne Petrie's novel, The Street. Finally, she was in a place where she was not merely black. I like to think of Emmylou and Helga and Ludi and Jewel and King Solomon brushing shoulders with Garcia Lorca, who was unable to grasp the various paths they followed as refugees and fugitives in that black city where he was a tourist. There are many paths, but how many destinations for this journey? Some, like Helga Crane, are immediately taken in, content to live within the boundary. Some, like Emmylou, long to see 135th Street and then find it does not merit their expectation. Surely there must have been many like Jewel for whom the destination itself did not conjure any particular magic, or others like Pinky who would like to be anywhere, not there, thinking of flight but with no place to go. There is no going home, and the place where you have arrived offers no substantial shelter. Emmylou and Helga Crane both leave Harlem. Ludi is driven to commit a gruesome murder and then flees too. Reading their stories as a teenager in Texas, I only cared about the first part of their irresistible trajectory, an outward, upward momentum. Of my own arrival, I can say that it is difficult to tell the beginning without any inkling of the end, to show you the light of enchantment without the shadow of disenchantment. I no longer find anything remarkable about my own arrival here. It was not the arrival of a fugitive or a refugee. That feeling of running from something or running to something only came later in the very streets where I was living, and often simultaneously. I cannot fit my entry into Harlem into a neat narrative arc like those of Emmylou and Helga or Ludi and Pinky. I come to New York for a visit with the faintest unresolved notion of making a move. I bought the Amsterdam News on a Thursday when the apartment listings would be new and called up the cheapest spots. I saved that paper so I can tell you that the listing described as Harlem, one-bedroom, renovated, locked doors, no fee, for $775, with a minimum income of $40,000 that I did not have, was already taken when I called. The one-bedroom for $775 with hardwood floors and new appliances in an elevator building must have also gone quickly. That would have left the studio apartment on Edgecombe Avenue for $675, which actually was not an option. A previous bad experience of cramped studio living had taught me the true nature of my Texan sense of space. At the top of the page, I found the ad for 3 rooms, floor-through apartment, no kitchen, clean, non-smoker, references required. When I called the number, the owner said the apartment wasn't taken. In the margin of the now creased and aged newsprint, there are directions I quickly scrawled. I went uptown at once. The apartment was located in the very last house on the block of 120th Street between Lenox and 7th Avenues. I met the landlady on the garden level and followed her up 3 flights of decrepit stairs. We entered the available apartment on the top floor. Its green painted hallways and matching green carpet were hideous, but there was light streaming in from the front and back windows and a skylight presiding over the entryway and landing. To cross from the front to the back required a short stroll. It was, even without a kitchen, the very definition of happiness. I wrote a check for the first and last month's rent and then went downtown to collect my things. At the time, the miraculous location of a floor-through brownstone apartment, even a floor-through brownstone apartment without a kitchen and with a lamentable green hallway complemented by ugly green wall-to-wall carpeting, held a certain sense of destiny. It was meant to be. The notion that an apartment without a kitchen was ever anyone's destiny has to do with the general desperation of real estate in New York City, but it was a good indication of how I saw the world then. I needed Providence as an escort on my own ascent from the subway station into Harlem. I I too was going to meet a place I'd already filled with so many expectations. I too would have to match the pictures in my mind, the ones I'd invented and the ones I'd seen in books, with the world that was now my own. But I did not immediately rush out to follow the trails of my favorite Harlem characters. I did not rush to stand before the hallowed sites where history had been made. I did not rush at all. I moved slowly, keeping a deliberately languid pace, because some part of me needed to pretend that my body was still in Texas, and my eyes were still in Texas too, because I could not give up the habit, and did not lose it until much later, of meeting the eyes of every person I met. I did not know, or did know and didn't mind, that it was through the eyes I would be dragged into stories. I met eyes with the older ladies who gathered in front of buildings, and with the elderly men who sat on park benches in the median, as the traffic rushed north and south around them. When crossing paths with men who seemed about to make an unwanted advance, I smiled brightly and shouted hi, like an overexcited flight attendant, and then kept walking while they were too stunned to reply. But often I did not refuse when a man offered to walk with me some part of the laid down Lenox Avenue, always ending such promenades at the corner of my block. Once, I saw an old lady struggling with her groceries and offered my hands. We walked together for a while, but when she too stopped at the corner where her street met Lenox Avenue, I was puzzled, alarmed that my assistance could be confused for predation. I did not make a pilgrimage to the home of Langston Hughes. Instead, I met, probably in the street, a young man who lived in Hughes's old house and made certain everyone knew his fact within minutes of making his acquaintance. I did not immediately go up to the Schomburg Center. Instead, I spent hours at a branch library, reading the newspaper and waiting to use the public computers in order to look for a job. Eventually, I started going out to dances and art openings, but many more nights I stayed inside, listening to the radio and the sounds of traffic on 7th Avenue. I'm skipping ahead a little bit, just that's smarter parts. During those first months in New York, I was busy with an assignment at my new job with a Harlem-based publisher to pour through the archives of photographer James Vanderzee in order to make a new book of his images. Vanderzee's photo studio operated during the heights of the Harlem Renaissance, capturing Harlemites in elegant portraits, wearing their finest threads. His were the kind of pictures that would have had pride of place on a mantle or be tucked into an envelope along with a letter sent back home. A tableau of the good life available up north. When Vanderzee's work was rediscovered in the late 60s by curators of the controversial Harlem on My Mind exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, his photographs of cosmopolitan Harlem provided an antidote to the destitute, shell-shocked image then attached to the neighborhood, and which formed a new iconography of its best days. Vanderzee's Harlem is a province of extravagance, culture, and high society. We meet the delicate young students of a dancing school, adorable in 100 different ways, and the dandified members of all male social clubs. In individual portraits of cultured ladies and fine gentlemen, unidentified Harlemites whose personal histories are not preserved display the glamour and bearing of celebrities and aristocrats. A couple poses in front of an exquisite convertible sedan clad in matching full-length raccoon fur coats. A group portrait shows a vast wedding party, the bridesmaids wearing matching taffeta headgear, and the men dressed in white tie, all attended by a retinue of flower girls and ring bearers. Improbably, Vanderzee's signature, etched into the negative of these photos, shows that both pictures were taken in 1932, during the depths of the Great Depression. Outside the archive, I compared the buildings and the faces I saw on the street to the buildings and the faces in the photographs. It was easy to establish which intersection is the setting of a certain parade, and easy to note how soot and grime had attached to the facade of a certain church. But it was not possible, just by looking, to establish a direct connection between the people I saw, motionless in the photographs, and coursing through the streets. One could assume a trajectory, the continuity of families across 8 or 9 decades. Here we have arrived, the photographs whispered, and here we remain, came the answer from the streets. But I noticed in the contemporary faces some alteration, the consequence of a force not visible within the frame. Within, I was always looking for approval, seeking it out in a return smile. I was looking for mutuality. I was not known by anyone. They could not verify my background. I was unable, therefore, to truly lay claim to this place where I landed. My relationship to it was, for some time, like the effect of a picturesque landscape that hangs as a backdrop in a portrait studio, with the sitter arranged statically in foreground. It was a setting. It was not exactly history. How much time do we have left? 10, 15 minutes? Okay. I'll show you one more photo and then talk a little bit about it and read you a short section to close. So, I talk about this photo in the book. I won't read you that section because it's actually quite long. But this photo is something I discovered when I was just browsing through the archives of the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, which is basically the most world-renowned research center, probably certainly in America, that focuses on African descendant people. And this photograph is a street scene, and there's so many street scenes of Harlem. It was a place where many photographers, certainly people that lived in Harlem, took pictures of their neighbors and the streets that surrounded them, but it was also a destination where a lot of photographers, particularly in the 30s and 40s when there was sort of a rise in the social documentary tradition, sort of went to Harlem to document. And so there's so many street scenes, and as a researcher, I was inundated by street scenes. And so when I found this, I was like, oh, another Harlem street scene. But then the caption of the photograph was, within 30 seconds of the 135th Street branch of the library. And so this intersection, just about here, is the original building of the 135th Street branch library, which became the Schomburg Center. And I was fascinated by the definition of this image in relationship to the library. The library was a place, like many libraries, most of the libraries in New York were founded with funds from Andrew Carnegie. This one, once Harlem became a center of Black New York, the librarians who worked there decided they would do something to address their local population. And the head librarian was a white woman, and she had an assistant who was a Black librarian, and they together started taking clippings and collecting books related to Black history and African history. And this special collection was so much used and so popular that people came to the library constantly, and they used these books until they fell apart. It was this sort of search for knowledge, and the idea that you could go to a library and discover a world that meaning was incredibly powerful at that moment. It was the moment when, not just in Harlem, but around the country, there was just a huge flowering of culture and the idea of defining what they called the new Negro for this moment when Blacks were moving into the cities, and there was a chance, sort of famous quote from Elaine Locke about Harlem in 1925 was that Harlem would be the place from which the Black entered the American democracy. So it wasn't just an idea of like, we're going to live in this place, but it was what this place meant on sort of a world historical scale, even at the very beginning of its founding. So this picture is a weird like reference of all of that to me, because of all these people in the streets and how they're just the sort of bustling city life. And the library, even now, is not just a place where you go to do research. It's a place where when you show up, there will be sort of scholars and researchers, but also children who are there consulting. Even though it's a research library, there will be children in a research library. It's that kind of place. And also people who are, it can be very eccentric people that are on their own quest for knowledge. And I sort of talk about all of that in this chapter. And Arthur Schomburg, who founded it, he was a Black man from Puerto Rico. He moved to New York from Puerto Rico. And as a child, his sort of passion for history and knowledge had been sparked by a teacher who told him that Black people had no history. And that started this sort of lifelong quest. He was a book collector and antiquarian, and spent all of his time, he was a bank clerk, and during lunch hours, searching through the bookstalls in downtown New York, looking for these lost volumes of Black history. And he was connected with a whole network of men who were just as, and women, but certainly in the early 1900s, mostly men, in these sort of societies. I mean, not unlike the way the Charleston Library Society was founded, really. They gathered themselves together to pool their resources for knowledge. And this institution is his legacy. But I'm also always fascinated by the stories that never make it into books and the stories that don't make it into the library. And so I want to read a section that comes after the library, the building section itself, about another sort of search for knowledge. And I'll end with that. Some time passed before I knew Julius Bobby Nelson by name. This is because when I first arrived on Lenox Avenue, I did not know anyone and was not known by anyone. When I passed in and out of my front door, the people standing at my stoop would part to let me enter and part to let me leave. For a long time, little was exchanged between us except excuse me and thank you. I didn't know who they were or where they lived, these older people who stood facing Lenox Avenue during the day, or the younger ones who came at night to guard the same spots. But they seemed to belong there more than I did, provoking in me the impulse to apologize for my presence at my own front door. I was not used to living in the middle of it all, right there on the avenue, with only the thinnest of veils to pass through before meeting the world. I don't remember if I was going out or coming in the day I met Julius Bobby Nelson. I don't even remember for certain if what I'm about to tell you happened on the day we formally met, or if it's simply a day I remember with some clarity, because what he said compelled me to write it down. I would have already known his face by then, and he would have known mine. It was spring. I'd probably stopped under a tree to speak with Miss Bessie or Miss Minnie when Julius Bobby Nelson got my attention and beckoned me with a pull of his eyes and his hand and a flick of his chin. I knew he wanted me to come closer and listen. To listen well, one must come close indeed, for his speech is impeded. I am not sure of the reason, but the longer I listened, the clearer he became, and the more I understood. Sometimes I heard him with a tantalizing clarity, but then a crucial word would disappear into the back of his mouth, never reaching my ear. Before I knew him by name, I knew him by this manner of speaking. In my head, I thought of him as the mumbler. He did not seem bothered by or necessarily aware of my difficulty in understanding him. I never noticed anyone else having this difficulty. When I still knew him as the mumbler, we had at least one exchange. He told me that he was a champ, that he'd been almost pro. I never did ask what he was champion of. I assumed it was boxing, and I assumed that was why he spoke the way he did. On the day I learned his name, Julius Bobby Nelson beckoned to me and said, "I live here. I grew up here." And I knew immediately that he did not mean the city or even our neighborhood, but the block in which we stood. He is a tall man, and as he stood there, it was like he stood on the whole block at once. He waved his large hand in a gesture only slightly more dramatic than the one that drew me into his audience. He took the whole block into view, indicating the breadth of his knowledge and the passage of time. He told me that his mother and father had lived at number 469, the building adjacent to mine. His sister had lived in number 471, and his school had been PS 89, the Douglas School. He pointed at the Douglas School, which was no longer there. We both faced the direction of where it was not, on the southwest corner of 135th Street and Lenox Avenue, directly across from the library, where a tall apartment building now stood. He mentioned names and characters and happenings without any explicit suggestion of their significance. It was in this way that I learned about the gypsies, about the Guinea Italian in the cigar shop who wouldn't sell him a hot dog, about Dick's Liquor, about Chicken Joe and the butcher. It was in this way I learned that they didn't kill the white lady at the school. At the time, the facts hung together in a manner that fails in the retelling. And you will understand that I did not stop to ask him who were they and who was the white lady, or under what circumstances did they not kill her at the school. To point in a different direction was to land upon another set of disjointed facts. He pointed across the street where Lenox Terrace is now, and he said, "I built it," and he said, "bricks," and he said, 20-year lease, and he said, "horse and carriage." As before, I did not stop to beg him for clarification. He told me that his 9 brothers had lived across the street. He said something about the all-boys school on 119th while looking down the avenue in that direction. When his eyes came back to rest on me, he said, "I live here, I grew up here, I know all of it." Julius Bobby Nelson told me more of what he knew and I continued not to understand all of what he told me. He said he was born in Charleston, South Carolina, and later when I went inside and wrote this part down, I noted that he repeated it with a certain glint in his eye. He told me about a river, but I did not understand the name of it, and his repetition did not help. Mrs. Barber was sitting there under the tree with us, and she understood what I did not. He was talking about the Cooper River, she said, and she asked, "What about that river?" Whether he answered or what was the meaning, I did not record. Some importance was attached to it, I later noted, or merely my own curiosity. He returned to more immediate geography. First, he pointed northeast to the Franklin Theater on 135th Street, just off Lenox, which is now a church, and then to another theater, the Lincoln on 132nd Street, behind McDonald's, which is now an empty shell. He pointed behind me, and for a moment I did not turn in that direction. I knew he was pointing at the funeral home on the next block. He said he was friends with the man, but I don't know if he meant the proprietor or the man being buried that day. It was then he began to present riddles even stranger than before. "Watch the walking, not the dead," he told me, and I had to have him repeat it. "The ones who are walking, not the ones lying down," he said. I asked him to run it by me one more time, and then he said something about having laid a body out. "I am what I am," he told me. "I am the law." That was it. Was there anything more to say? Thus did God rebuke the impudence of Moses when he dared to ask the unspeakable name. I went inside. Later that afternoon, I left the house again, and I saw Julius again, and he began again. "I am what I am, who I am." Now Miss Bessie was sitting under the tree. He pointed to her and said he knew her son, her daughter-in-law, and a long list of other relatives. Miss Bessie nodded to affirm his knowledge of her whole family. I did not doubt that he could tell me the name of every person who had ever lived on that block. "I know everybody," he said, and pointed again in the direction of the funeral home, as if to continue the point he had begun earlier. Clearer than anything else he said that day, he asked, "See that hearse over there?" My notes drop off here. I didn't write down what he told me about the hearse or who was in it. I did write down that Julius Bobby Nelson mumbled something more about the South and about Mississippi, but those were the only words I made out. I did not speculate as to what he meant to tell me, but I was sure it was something pertinent. Once he pointed toward the library, but made sure to indicate that he meant the old library. "I went through all the books," he told me. "I've read every book that you've